So of course in this session, after lunch each day, we're looking at the compassion wing of practice. And the compassion wing of practice, of course, is very important in the context of Shamatha Vipashyana. Because without the compassion wing of practice, this Shamatha Vipashyana practice, just doing that, we could become very self-absorbed in those practices. Whereas we want to be using those practices to better be in the world. So to avoid using these practices as a way of withdrawing, the compassion practice will help us to stay connected and also, of course, give us that good direction for these Shamatha and Vipashyana practices as well. And so far we've looked at the loving kindness and compassion practices. And today I'd like to look at the empathetic joy and equanimity practices. And these four practices together form the core of the compassion practice. And these are presented with a presentation called the four immeasurables, meaning that we are cultivating these qualities towards immeasurable living beings, meaning all living beings. So of course, loving kindness, Maitri in Sanskrit, Pali metta, is again the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. So immeasurable loving kindness, of course, is the wish for all living beings to have happiness in its causes. Compassion in Sanskrit and Pali is karuna. And of course, compassion is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering in its causes. So immeasurable compassion, of course, is the wish for all living beings to be free of suffering in its causes. So what we saw there was that both loving kindness and compassion are not emotions, they are aspiration or a wish. Aspiration to have happiness and the aspiration to be free of suffering. So of course, if we want to cultivate both of those, as we saw, then for loving kindness, of course, we need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. And for compassion, then we need to know what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, how do we eliminate those causes. Because if we don't know these things, then loving kindness and compassion is really just words with no meaning. And we saw there that we are to cultivate these in stages, and that particularly in our modern society we add one stage extra at the beginning, that is to cultivate loving kindness and compassion to ourselves first. Because if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, then it's impossible really to expand that out to others. And so we go through those stages of self, friend, stranger, difficult person, and then all living beings. And we saw there in the context of loving kindness, it's important to distinguish that from attachment. And that in a relationship, both of these dynamics are present usually, and to distinguish these two and to reduce the attachment, increase loving kindness as much as possible if we want our relationships to improve. And to really appreciate that attachment is pervasive in our life. it's actually the main driving force in our life, and to appreciate that probably we'll be spending the rest of our life dealing with it and reducing it. And it's not like by next week we'll eliminate it. And then in terms of compassion, we saw there that we talked about anger, and that anger, of course, like attachment, is one of the three main mental afflictions, what's called the three poisons. And we saw there that one of the reasons we tend to get angry with people is we do this cognitive fusion, that we are fusing a person and their behaviour into one thing and seeing that there's a bad person, nasty person. And then, of course, what we don't like is their behaviour, but because we've fused the behaviour to the person, we end up directing that rejection to the person. We get angry at the person, we attack the person. And so we saw there that one helpful thing to do to overcome anger is don't do cognitive fusion, because cognitive fusion is a false, invalid perspective. So rather see simply there is a person who's just like us, they want to be happy, want to be free of suffering, they're engaging in this very harmful behaviour, which is just leading to a lot of suffering, and so then we can have compassion for the person, and at the same time not tolerate that negative behaviour and address that negative behaviour, and if necessary use force to stop that person from behaving in that negative way. And what we saw also with that cognitive fusion is that we end up with a fixed, biased view of people. And actually, cognitive fusion causes division. Because if people are behaving badly and we call them bad people, then of course they're the bad people, I'm one of the good people, so let's get rid of those bad people and only have good people. So it causes conflict. Whereas if we don't do cognitive fusion, then there's not like good people, bad people, there's just people, all of which sometimes do good things and bad things. So, in fact, whereas cognitive fusion causes division, if we don't do cognitive fusion, that unites and leads to cooperation instead of conflict. So cognitive fusion leads to anger, hatred, conflict. The correct perspective leads to cooperation, compassion, and then dealing effectively with those difficult situations.
Yeah, this is very naive way of
Naive?
For me, yeah.
How is it naive?
Because I really want to find the approach of compassion. Like
Correct.
Full compassion. And
And
how is it naive? People have tendencies which are, in a way, going with them. And
people have strong tendencies?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Everyone has strong tendencies.
yeah, so this fusion of person and act is not just an illusion, it's also like an actual fact.
No, it's not a fact. It's not a fact. Either we have strong tendencies or we are our strong tendencies. Do we have strong tendencies or are we our strong tendencies? We have strong tendencies. We have anger. We have jealousy. These are all things which we have. They're not us. So if we say we are strong tendencies, that is actually an invalid perspective.
Yeah, but all of that doesn't mean that you can just separate action from person.
Exactly. I was hoping someone would bring this up. We're not talking about separation. So what we do is we do these are the two extremes. One extreme is we identify bad person. The other one is we separate. I didn't do it. I'm not responsible. It's not me. So that's the other extreme. Identification and separation, or denial, as often the case is, are the two extremes. The middle way is distinguishing person from behaviour. A person is definitely responsible for behaviour, but they're not their behaviour. And if we see it that way, which is the correct perspective, then we've got a chance of resolving it.
Emotionally resolve our anger.
Sorry?
Then we have a chance of emotionally resolve our anger towards the person, yeah?
Actually, you'll find that if you simply have a correct, like for example, let's say mother has a young child who's got some problem in the brain, and so as a result of that, the child is getting very angry and beating the mother. Does the mother get angry at the child when he does that? No, because he sees the child has got an illness. So it's just compassion. Because the mother has the correct perspective. The child is not a bad child, it's a child who has an illness. And so if we saw everyone that way, we wouldn't get angry. We'd have compassion and see that they're just creating a lot of suffering for themselves and for the people around them. So remember, compassion is not about sitting there smiling and saying, oh, you're really a nice person. That's not compassion, that's stupidity. Compassion is, again, the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. Which means, if someone's behaving badly, the compassionate thing to do is not tolerate that at all, and to help that person to overcome that negative behaviour, and, if necessary, use force to do that. That's compassion. That's really the only effective way we're going to resolve things. If we have cognitive fusion, we get angry, we attack, they attack us back, and we see what's happening on the planet due to that. I mean, it's getting worse, isn't it? We're destroying ourselves.
So either you are powerful,
Either
you are powerful, you have the power to stop the person from doing something, or you have an illusion. Like, this is the two options that we are stuck. What about the option of you know this person is not intrinsic, or this act is not intrinsic to the person, but then you don't have the power to stop it, or...
And that's often the case.
So what then?
What then? What do you mean, what then?
Other than being a victim, what other option?
Not to take it personally.
Well, I mean, like, give me a concrete example. Just give me an example.
A little girl being abused by a grown-up man.
Well, then you report that to the police, and you say, and then they arrest that person.
She is a little girl. It's happening on the street.
Yeah.
On the dark street, no one can see.
Well, then you grab that person if you can.
No, I'm not there. She is experiencing it. A powerless person.
Well, how do you know if it's happening if you're not there?
Defend herself.
Sorry?
Things like that are happening.
Right, and?
When a powerless person.
Right. Of course. Sure.
A powerful act of another person.
Right, and that's happening everywhere on the planet. Exactly. And the only way to try to resolve that effectively is using wisdom and compassion. Can we definitely resolve it? Maybe not. But bringing in hatred and anger is not going to solve anything. It's going to make it worse.
Of course, but also just the wisdom of separation between act and person is not...
It's not separation. The person is responsible for behaviour. We're not separating. The person is responsible for their behaviour. We're not separating them. That's the other extreme. So the only way that really we can have a chance of resolving is using wisdom and compassion. And we see this actually in our sort of jail system. In jail systems where we punish people, statistically, it's a higher cost to society because they reoffend. If we have, and some countries do have this, they have jail systems where they try to rehabilitate the people. Is there a guarantee that they will rehabilitate? No. But if they don't, they keep them out of society. But in countries that try to rehabilitate people, even the economic cost to society is much reduced. And then also what happens is those people that are rehabilitated often become the champions of that and then go on to to explain the downside of doing legal behaviour. So I'm not saying that if we do this, we'll fix everything. Of course not, because people have mental afflictions, people behave badly. But if we want the best possible chance of having a good outcome, that's the only thing to do. If we bring in hatred and anger and punish people, it's going to get worse. And we see that on the planet.
I think for me what is important is to acknowledge that the situation still is complex. Like,
of course it's complex.
This doesn't make it...
Exactly, and that came up before. There are many complex situations. To understand those complex situations are not easy. But as a framework, as a basis for trying to understand them, if we don't have wisdom and compassion, I think we've got no hope. We've got no hope. Can we understand them? Maybe not. Can we resolve them? Maybe not. But at least if we have wisdom and compassion as the basis, we've got the best chance of understanding and the best chance of resolving. If we don't have that, I think we've got no hope. I mean, we're just going to destroy us. Well, you are. We're destroying the planet. So I'm not saying this is a magic cure to all complex situations. I'm just saying if we have this framework, that's the best chance we've got of doing something useful. That's all. Okay. How to deal with anger. So I didn't cover that yesterday, but it's more or less the same formula as dealing with attachment. Actually, we can apply this to all mental afflictions, but just to go through them again so we can remember, we can remind ourselves. Of course, the first point with any mental affliction is have a clear understanding of the mental affliction and how it is destructive, because otherwise if we think that this mental affliction actually is quite useful sometimes, we're not going to want to overcome it. So that's the first point. And as with attachment, I think together with that we really need to really cultivate this view of genuine happiness, that as long as we feel that the source of my happiness, the source of my suffering is out there, then of course whenever we meet something pleasant, attachment will follow. And if we meet something unpleasant, aversion, hatred, anger will follow. And so if we can cultivate that as well, then we have a very good basis for now really beginning to deal with anger or any other mental affliction when it's arising. And of course, the key to dealing with it when it's actually arising is mindfulness. Because again, if we don't have mindfulness, we can have all the desire in the world to deal with mental afflictions. It's not going to happen. Not going to happen. Because it will arise, it will take control of our mind before we know it, and then about the only thing we can do is get out of there fast before we say and do things we're going to regret. So the key, of course, is to catch that mental affliction early. So remember, we have this whole bandwidth of mind. Now our threshold is up here. We only notice things here. We don't notice any of this more subtle mental activity. So this mental affliction is building up, and we only notice it when it's here. And already when it's here, it's got control of our mind, and then it's too late. But if we can cultivate mindfulness, improve mindfulness through shamatha practice, this threshold will move way down here. We'll be able to pick it up much earlier when we're still in control. And then, of course, one thing very effective to do is just observe it. Because if we observe the mental affliction, we're free of it. And then, if we can observe it here, it will just pass very quickly. And in addition to that, of course, we saw we can apply antidotes. So remember we saw that in the wisdom side of the practice, one very good antidote is impermanence. To see things as changing moment by moment. But again, if we really want to use this sort of antidote, then simply an intellectual understanding of impermanence, which I think we all have now, is not really going to be enough. It needs to become experiential. We need to internalize that. We need, through the Vipashyana practice of impermanence, we need to be starting to see things experientially as flow. And if we're seeing them in that way, then actually, as we saw yesterday, or the day before rather, this attachment's got nothing to grab, and an anger or aversion has nothing to push against. So you'll find that experientially seeing things as this flow will also act as an antidote, very effective antidote to pretty well all mental afflictions. But of course at the deeper level, this wisdom of emptiness, which is going to be a major part of the second part of the retreat here in Vipashyana, is really come to experientially see there is no independent me here, no independent person there, no independent anger. If we can really start to see this, then there is no basis for any mental affliction to arise. Because the mental afflictions arise on the basis of grasping to an independent me. And of course we'll talk much more about that in the second half of the retreat. And then of course applying an antidote from the compassion wing of practice. Again, what we've seen here in terms of anger is of course avoid the cognitive fusion, but also again have a very broad perspective. Because if we simply have a perspective of a situation of how is this situation affecting me, then if it's unpleasant, probably aversion, maybe anger and so forth will rise. Whereas if we can have a second person perspective, how is this person seeing this situation, and we avoid cognitive fusion, then I think what you'll find is that if that person is behaving badly, then compassion will arise and we'll do whatever we can to help that person to overcome that negative behaviour. So this sort of formula, I think we can apply to most mental afflictions.
Can you repeat the number 2?
Yeah. Number 2, view of genuine happiness, again, is, and this we'll talk more about this, we've already mentioned it briefly when we talked about loving kindness, but it'll come up again when we talk about the emptiness practice. And that is that now, for us, at least instinctively, it seems like the source of my happiness is out there. And instinctively, it seems like the source of my suffering is out there. So if we can, and of course the Buddhist position is that's an illusion. That actually the source of suffering and happiness is within. So if we can shift that to really appreciate, again, not just intellectually, but start to have an experiential appreciation that the source of suffering and happiness is within, then we'll have more ground to deal with mental afflictions. Because if we don't make that shift, then the natural result of seeing something pleasant will be attachment. The natural result of seeing something unpleasant will be aversion. It'll be very difficult to deal with mental afflictions if we don't make that shift. It'll be very difficult. Okay, so let's now look at the last 2 of the 4 immeasurables. actually, before that, I want to address one thing. Compassion. And I think I briefly mentioned this yesterday, is we often hear about compassion and burnout. But actually, there's no such thing. Because you can't burn out having an aspiration for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. What is called compassion burnout is actually empathy burnout. And of course, empathy is necessary for compassion, because if we don't have empathy, then compassion will not arise. But what often happens is that particularly people who are confronted with a lot of suffering, social workers, aid workers and so forth, they have a lot of empathy. But together with empathy, there's a sense of hopelessness, no hope. And of course that will lead to burnout. Whereas empathy plus hope leads to compassion. And hope comes from wisdom, understanding what is the real source of suffering and how to overcome that. And this is very nicely presented it's actually in a book from Matthew Ricard called Altruism, the Power of Compassion to Change Yourself and the World. But there's also someone has taken a section of that book and put it as an article on the internet titled From Empathy to Compassion in Neuroscience Laboratory. So I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs from this. I find it very, very helpful. I think most of you probably know who Mathieu Ricard is, a very famous French Buddhist monk who also does a lot of work together with people in neuroscience. And he said, in his book, but it's in an article here, he says, in 2007, along with Tanya Singer, I was in Rainer Goebbels' neuroscience laboratory in Maastricht as a collaborator and a guinea pig in the research program on empathy. Tanya would ask me to give rise to a powerful feeling of empathy by imagining people affected by great suffering. During the pause after the first series of periods of meditation, Tanya asked me, "What are you doing? It doesn't